Part 3. Dawn of Mortal Life. The clay remembered being stars. This was the secret that Prometheus discovered in those hidden moments between Zeus's commands and Olympus's celebrations, in those quiet spaces where he could work unobserved. The earth itself, the humble clay that squelched between divine fingers, contained within it the memory of its cosmic origins, the death of ancient stars whose explosive endings had seeded space with the heavy elements that would eventually coalesce into worlds. In each handful of mud was the history of the universe, the story of matter's long journey from simplicity to complexity, from fire to form. Prometheus worked in a valley that had no name because names required namers, and the beings who would give names to all things had not yet drawn breath. The valley lay in that part of the world where the borders between elements remained soft, where earth and water negotiated their boundaries with each tide, where air and fire danced together in the morning mist that rose from warm springs. It was a place of potential, of becoming, where the strict categorizations that would later define reality had not yet crystallized into law. The other gods knew he went there, but assumed he was simply indulging in the kind of solitary contemplation that marked him as different from their boisterous company. Zeus, secure in his victory and drunk on the ambrosia of absolute power, paid little attention to his strange counselor's wanderings. The thunder god was busy with his own pursuits, seducing, commanding, establishing the hierarchies that would define divine society for aeons to come. If Prometheus wished to play in the mud like a child, while the real gods reshaped the cosmos, what concern was it of his? But Prometheus was not playing. He was listening. The clay spoke to him in a language older than words, communicating through texture and temperature, through the way it responded to divine touch. Each type of earth had its own personality, its own potential. The red clay from riverbeds was passionate but unstable, quick to form but equally quick to dissolve. The black earth from volcanic slopes held power but also destruction, creating forms that were strong but brittle. The gray clay from the deep places where sunlight never reached was patient and enduring, but slow to take shape, resistant to change once formed. He experimented with them all, mixing and matching, seeking the perfect combination that could hold not just form, but something more. That spark of awareness that would separate the living from the merely animated. For animation was easy. Any god could breathe motion into matter, could make statues dance or stones sing. But true life, conscious life, life that could look back at its creator and ask why, that was something else entirely. The first attempts were failures, though even failure taught him much. He would shape the clay into forms of beauty and symmetry, breathe divine breath into them, and watch them move with perfect grace. But their eyes remained empty, their movements mechanical. They were puppets, not persons, dolls dancing to divine will rather than their own. He would unmake them gently, returning their substance to the earth with something approaching tenderness, promising the clay that he would try again, that he would not give up until he found the secret of true creation. It was Athena who inadvertently provided the crucial insight, though she never knew it. She came upon him one day in his valley, drawn by curiosity about his secret project. She found him surrounded by half-formed figures, some beautiful, some grotesque, all lifeless despite the divine energy he had poured into them. She laughed, not cruelly, but with the honest amusement of one who sees a colleague struggling with something that should be simple. "You're trying too hard," she said, picking up a handful of clay and absently shaping it as they talked. "Creation isn't about force, Prometheus. It's about invitation. You're trying to push life into these forms, but perhaps you should be creating forms that invite life to enter." She left the small figure she had been playing with on a stone and departed, her point made. But after she was gone, Prometheus studied what she had created. It was simpler than his attempts, less perfect, less symmetrical. It had flaws, a slightly crooked nose, one shoulder higher than the other, hands that were just slightly too large for its body. But there was something about those imperfections that suggested possibility, that left room for growth, for change, for becoming. Imperfection. That was the key. The gods were perfect, complete, finished. They could change their forms, but not their essential natures. They were what they were, eternal and immutable. But these new beings, these potential mortals, needed to be incomplete, needed to have space within them for growth, for learning, for evolution. They needed to be capable of becoming more than they were, which meant starting as less than they could be. With this new understanding, Prometheus began again. This time, he didn't try to create perfect forms. Instead, he crafted beings with built-in contradictions, with tensions that would drive them forward. He gave them bodies that were fragile but resilient, that could be broken but could also heal. He gave them minds capable of both reason and madness, hearts that could hold both love and hate, spirits that could aspire to divinity while remaining anchored in mortality. The proportions required endless adjustment. Too much divine essence, and they would be minor gods, immortal and static. Too much earthly matter, and they would be mere animals, clever perhaps, but not truly conscious. The balance had to be precise, enough divinity to spark consciousness, enough mortality to ensure growth, enough strength to survive, but not so much that survival would be guaranteed, enough wisdom to learn, but not so much that there would be nothing left to discover. As he worked, Prometheus found himself thinking of his brothers, of the family he had betrayed for the sake of this future he was trying to create. In Atlas's strength, he saw the physical power these beings would need to reshape their world. In Epimetheus's hindsight, he saw the ability to learn from mistakes that would be crucial to their development. Even in Menoetius's rage, he saw the passion that would drive them to exceed their limitations. And in his own foresight, he saw the gift he would eventually give them. Not the ability to see the future with certainty, but the capacity to imagine it, to dream of tomorrows that might be. The valley became his workshop, his laboratory, his temple to potential. He built kilns from river stones to test how his clay figures would respond to fire. He exposed them to ice to see if they could endure cold. He submerged them in water to test if they could adapt to different elements. Most crumbled, or dissolved, or shattered. But with each failure, he learned more about the precise requirements of the life he was trying to create. It was during one of these experiments that the breakthrough came. A figure he had been working on, one that had shown unusual promise, had been left too close to one of his fires. The heat had partially melted it, destroying the careful proportions he had established. In frustration, he had thrown it into a pool of water to cool, and the sudden temperature change had caused it to crack in dozens of places. But as he pulled it from the water, ready to unmake it and start again, he noticed something extraordinary. The cracks had not destroyed the figure. They had transformed it. Water had seeped into the fissures, and when he breathed upon it, the breath traveled through these channels in a way it never had through solid clay. The figure didn't just receive the breath, it circulated it, transformed it, made it its own. Flaws as pathways, breaks as openings, damage as opportunity for growth. Working with renewed purpose, Prometheus began incorporating deliberate imperfections into his creations. He gave them skin that could be cut, but could also heal, leaving scars that would tell stories. He gave them bones that could break, but would grow back stronger. He gave them minds that could forget, because forgetting was as important as remembering. Without it, they would be paralyzed by the weight of accumulating experience. But still, something was missing. The forms were more promising now, more capable of hosting true life, but they remained empty vessels. They needed something more than divine breath, something more than clever construction. They needed a spark that was uniquely theirs, not borrowed from the gods, but generated from within. It was then that Prometheus remembered the gift the Cyclopes had given him, that eternal flame that could never be extinguished, never consumed, never diminished, no matter how much it gave of itself. He had carried it with him since the war, a small sun cradled in his immortal hands, waiting for a purpose that he was only now beginning to understand. Fire was transformation. Fire was the mediator between states, the force that turned solid to liquid to gas, that broke down the old to create the new. Fire was destruction, yes, but it was also renewal. It was the sunset that promised dawn, the ending that enabled beginning. And most importantly, fire was hunger, always consuming, always seeking, always reaching for more. It was the opposite of divine satisfaction, the antithesis of immortal completeness. But he could not simply place divine fire into mortal clay. The two substances were fundamentally incompatible. The fire would either consume the clay instantly or be smothered by it. There needed to be a buffer, a translator, something that could exist in both worlds simultaneously. Water. Water that remembered being ice and steam, that knew all states of being. Water that could carry fire without being consumed by it, that could soften clay without dissolving it. Water that moved in cycles, evaporating, condensing, falling as rain, flowing as rivers back to the sea, demonstrating that endings were also beginnings. Prometheus spent days by the spring that fed his valley, studying its properties, understanding its nature. This was not ordinary water, but something more primal. Water that had existed since the first rains, that contained within it the memory of every transformation it had undergone. He collected it in vessels made from his own crystallized breath, containers that could hold paradox without shattering. The mixing was the most delicate operation he had ever attempted. Too much fire, and the water would evaporate. Too much water, and the fire would drown. But there was a point, a perfect balance, where the two existed in harmony. Fire floating in water like stars in the night sky, water dancing around fire like planets around a sun. It created something new, something that had never existed before. A medium that was both and neither, a substance that could bridge the gap between divine and mortal, eternal and temporary. When he finally introduced this mixture to his clay figures, the result was immediate and extraordinary. The forms didn't just animate, they awakened. Their eyes, which had been mere decorative features, suddenly became windows. Their mouths, which had been simple openings, became sources of sound that was almost speech. Their hands, which had been mere appendages, began reaching, grasping, exploring. But they were still incomplete. They moved with purpose, but without direction. They looked, but did not see. They reached, but did not grasp meaning. They needed something more, not just life, but context for that life, not just existence, but purpose for that existence. Prometheus understood then that he could not create humanity alone. These beings were meant to be social, to exist in relationship with each other and with the world around them. A single human would be a contradiction, a social being without society, a speaker without listeners, a lover without beloved. He needed to create not just individuals, but a species, not just beings, but a people. He began creating them in pairs and groups, designing them to complement each other. Some he made stronger in body, others in mind. Some he gifted with great passion, others with deep calm. Some could run like the wind, others could endure like mountains. But all of them he made incomplete in some way, requiring others to achieve wholeness. It was a cruel kindness, condemning them to need each other, but in that need, creating the possibility for love, for friendship, for all the bonds that would make their brief lives worth living. As he worked, he found himself singing, not the hymns of Olympus, but something new, a working song that seemed to rise from the clay itself. It was a song of becoming, of potential realizing itself, of matter transcending its limitations. The figures seemed to respond to it, their forms solidifying when the melody was strong, their features becoming more distinct when the harmony was perfect. Days passed, or perhaps years. Time moved strangely in the valley, as if it too were still deciding what it wanted to be. Prometheus lost himself in the work, forgot about Olympus and its politics, forgot about Zeus and his commands, forgot about everything except the overwhelming need to complete this creation, to bring these beings fully into existence. He gave them voices capable of both songs and screams, because both would be necessary. He gave them tears that could express both joy and sorrow, often simultaneously. He gave them the ability to laugh, though he wondered if they would find much cause for it in the world Zeus was creating. He gave them dreams, so that even in sleep they could continue becoming, continue growing, continue reaching for something beyond themselves. But for all his gifts, he could not give them immortality. That was beyond his power, and perhaps beyond his desire. For in watching them take shape, he had come to understand that their mortality was not a flaw, but a feature. It was their temporary nature that would make them precious, their fleeting existence that would drive them to create meaning. An immortal could afford to wait, to delay, to postpone. But mortals, knowing their time was limited, would be forced to choose, to act, to make their brief moments count. Still, he wanted to give them something that would outlast their individual lives, something that would allow them to transcend their mortality, even while remaining mortal. Memory was part of it, the ability to pass experiences from one generation to the next. But memory alone wasn't enough. Memories could fade, could be distorted, could be lost. Language. That was what they needed. Not just the ability to communicate, but the power to encode meaning in symbols, to create words that could outlive their speakers, ideas that could survive their thinkers. He spent days crafting the structures in their throats that would allow for complex speech, the neural pathways that would let them connect sound to meaning to memory. But even as he gave them these gifts, he knew he was withholding the most important one: fire. Not the metaphorical fire that burned in their consciousness, but literal, physical fire. The tool that would let them cook food, forge metal, light the darkness, and ultimately challenge the gods themselves. That gift would have to wait, would have to be stolen, would have to be paid for with a price that made even Prometheus, who had seen it coming from the beginning, tremble. As he put the finishing touches on his creations, adjusting a feature here, smoothing a joint there, he became aware that he was being watched. Not by the gods. He would have sensed their presence immediately. This was something else, something new. It was his creations themselves, not yet fully alive, but somehow aware, watching their creator with eyes that held questions they didn't yet have words to ask. He looked back at them, these impossible beings balanced between dust and divinity, and felt something he had never experienced before. It wasn't love. That was too simple a word. It wasn't pride. That was too small an emotion. It was something that partook of both, but transcended either. A feeling that existed in the space between creator and creation, between father and child, between artist and art. It was responsibility. He had brought them to the threshold of existence, but he had not yet pushed them across. They stood at the boundary between potential and actual, waiting for the final breath that would transform them from could-be to are. And Prometheus hesitated, knowing that once he took this step, there would be no going back. The cosmos would be changed forever. The simple world of gods and titans would become complex with mortal perspectives, mortal needs, mortal defiance. He thought of Zeus, who would rage when he discovered what had been done. He thought of his fellow gods, who would see these creatures as either playthings or threats. He thought of his brothers, Atlas holding up the sky, Menoetius cast down to Tartarus, Epimetheus wandering free but lost without direction. He thought of all the futures he had seen spreading from this moment, most of them containing suffering that would make the Titanomachy look like a gentle disagreement. But he also thought of the other futures, the ones where humanity achieved things even the gods couldn't imagine. He saw cities of such beauty that Aphrodite would weep with envy. He saw songs that would make Apollo abandon his lyre in humility. He saw courage that would shame Ares, wisdom that would surprise Athena, love that would outlast Zeus's lightning. He saw mortals becoming more than mortals, not through divinity, but through humanity itself, through the choices they would make in the face of their limitations. The decision, in the end, was no decision at all. From the moment he had first shaped clay with conscious intent, this moment had been inevitable. He was Prometheus, the one who thinks ahead, and he had thought this through to its ultimate conclusion. The price would be paid, the suffering would be endured, but these beings would live. He gathered them all in the center of the valley, these clay figures waiting to become human. They stood in a circle, as if they already understood the importance of community, the power of gathering. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would soon be called dawn. The air was still, expectant, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Prometheus moved to the center of the circle, carrying with him the eternal flame the Cyclopes had given him. But he did not use it. Not yet. That would come later, would be stolen rather than given, would carry a different meaning. For now, he had something else to offer, something that would prepare them for the fire when it came. Hope. Not the reasonable hope that comes from calculating odds and assessing probabilities, but the unreasonable hope that persists despite evidence, that endures beyond logic, that survives even when trapped in a jar with all the world's evils. It was perhaps the cruelest gift he could give them, the ability to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. But it was also the kindest, for without it, the weight of mortality would crush them before they could take their first steps. He breathed it into them, this hope, watching as it spread from one to another like fire through dry grass, though they did not yet know what fire was. Their eyes opened fully for the first time, seeing not just light but meaning in the light. Their mouths opened, releasing not just sound, but the beginning of words. Their hands reached out, grasping not just objects, but connections with each other. They were alive. They were human. They were impossible and inevitable, fragile and resilient, mortal and transcendent. They looked at their Creator with eyes that already held the questions that would define their existence. Who are we? Why are we here? What should we do? What does it mean? Prometheus had no answers for them, or rather, he had too many answers, all of them partial, all of them true. But he did have one more gift to give them, though it would cost him everything. He looked up at Olympus, where the gods were stirring with the dawn, where Zeus would soon discover what had been done in secret. He looked at his humans, naked and vulnerable, without claws or fur, without the natural weapons that even the least of animals possessed. They would need fire, and he would get it for them. But not yet. First, they needed to understand their need, to feel their limitation, to know what they lacked. Only then would the gift of fire mean what it needed to mean. Not just a tool, but a symbol. Not just warmth, but enlightenment. Not just a theft, but a revolution.